Hi guys, welcome to week 9, diversity of simple organisms, bacteria, protists, and fungi. So, let's see if I can get this to work here. All right, so we talked briefly before about classifications and how, of course, in biology we have to organize everything, and we use characteristics usually to classify things along with the ribosome sequence, the genetic sequence of a specific part of the cell to help characterize organisms into 3 domains. We've got bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes, okay, or eukarya. Bacteria and archaea both fall under prokaryotes, and eukaryotes are pretty much everything else. You've got plants, animals, fungi, and then protists. And pretty much, if it is a eukaryote and it's not a plant, animal, or fungi, it falls into the protist category. These are usually single-celled or closely related to multicellular organisms. But we will talk in detail about all these. And what we're going to focus on this lecture is mostly simple organisms or single-celled organisms or simple multicellular organisms, okay? So let's talk about bacteria. So all bacteria are prokaryotes, all right? If you're looking at bacteria, it is a prokaryote. And what does it mean to be a prokaryote? Is you don't have membrane-bound organelles inside inside the cell. So you don't have a nuclear membrane around your DNA. You just have DNA kind of floating in the cell, inside the cell. And you don't have these organized structures internally. It's just all your stuff's kind of hanging out inside. It's a very simple structure. So, like I said, most prokaryotes are unicellular or single-celled, and they're generally much smaller than eukaryotic cells. And I'll show you some images later on to kind of re-emphasize this. Bacteria are everywhere. If you're touching something right now, it's got bacteria on it. If you're, your hands, your skin, the desk, the computer, you're touching, everything is covered in bacteria. So, and they're everywhere in the environment. But bacteria are very important. You've got your own bacteria on your skin that is basically considered your, bacteria. And if you say you shake someone's hand, which we aren't doing these days because of coronavirus, but if you shake someone's hand, you kind of trade bacteria with that person. And after like a day, your own bacteria will come along and basically get rid of that, like grow and get rid of the other person's bacteria. Obviously, if you wash your hands, you're going to wash away a lot of that bacteria, but your bacteria will not get completely washed away. It'll still be there. And bacteria are important for commercial things like baking, alcohol fermentation, many chemicals and enzymes and antibiotics all come from like bacteria or prokaryotes in general. Bacteria is also responsible for food going bad, spoiling, food poisoning. We'll talk a little bit about this later, but if you've ever had food poisoning, it's because of a bacteria that caused it. Tooth decay is caused by bacteria, and many diseases in general. All right, so let's look at down here at the bottom. We've got E. coli, which is just a generic bacteria. You can see that lightly in here that the DNA is floating kind of around in there. And just for comparison's sake, over here on the right, you can't even see the whole thing, is a human red blood cell. This is one of the smallest cells in your body, and it's still bigger, like many-fold bigger than a bacteria. Now, a lot of this other stuff floating around here is just to show you mostly viruses or other things like chlamydia here, but a lot of these other ones are just different viruses. Here we've got the nice Ebola virus that we had an outbreak in a few years back. And over in the top left corner is just a generic coronavirus. all coronaviruses are about that size, and you can see how small it is. If it infects your cell, it's going to go in there and make, you know, hundreds of thousands of copies of itself before it spits them out into the environment, into your internal environment. So you can kind of get a feel for how big the coronavirus is and why, you know, it's even a lot smaller than bacteria. So why it can easily float through the air, and things like that. All right, so how do we see bacteria or small, simple organisms? And obviously, we have to use something like a microscope to see these guys. We're not going to be able to see them with our naked eye. So you have to use a microscope. And one thing you can do when you're looking at the microscope is you can stain these cells to be able to see them better. Because if you just put bacteria in the microscope, it's going to be clear and it's going to be hard to see. But if you can stain it with a chemical that leaves a color there, a stain is what we call that, then you'll be able to visualize the bacteria easier under a microscope. So there's simple stains, which is just a single stain that leaves one color, or complex stains, which you can have two or more stains in combination. And usually these are multicolored, or even, I won't get too much into this, but you can use fluorescent stains that light up. If you shoot a light beam at it, or a laser beam at it, it can see it light up in different colors. And when we're working with bacteria in the microscope, we always have to use the oil immersion lens. That is the 100x lens on the microscope, so that we can visualize these guys, because they're so small. And you remember, if you have the 100x oil immersion lens and your 10x ocular lens, your total magnification is 1000x, right? So we use oil because the distance between the lens and the sample, the slide, is very small. And we really need to get a concentration amount of light through that sample to be able to see it, because just the light source alone might not have enough light coming through to be able to visualize the specimen. So we put a drop of oil on there, and so it makes like a little bond, a little bridge between the sample and the lens, so that you have this oil that helps focus the light through it and allows you to see it better. If you get down to things like viruses, though, you can't see those in a microscope. You got to use what we call electron microscopy, and we won't be getting into that too much, but it's where it uses electron scanning software, shoots electrons at the thing, and it gives you back an image on a computer screen. Anyway, so bacteria, back to bacteria. We talk about bacteria, and when you look into the microscope, it's very important you'll be able to see bacterial cell morphology, so the shape of the bacterial cell. And in general, bacteria have three shapes. You've got rod-shaped, or bacilli, we call it, and you see down here in the lower left, we've got rod-shaped bacteria. These are in a chain, so you can see they link end to end. You've also got spheres, which we call cocci. So over here on the right, we've got some cocci here, like Staphylococcus is a spherical shaped bacteria. Or you can also have corkscrews called spirilla, and down here in the bottom right, we've got some corkscrew shaped bacteria. So in addition to these suffixes, bacilli, cocci, and spirilla, we also have prefixes that we use based on how they grow as a group. So if you're growing in a cluster like we have up here on the top right, that would be staphylo. So this bacteria on the top right would be Staphylococcus, because it grows in a cluster and they're spherical shaped. So Staphylococcus. We also, if they grow end to end in a chain, you call it strepto. So down here on the lower left, we've got a streptobacillus, right? So streptobacillus, because it's rod shaped and growing in a chain. You can have streptococcus, so you have chain with spherical bacteria, or, like I said, staphylococcus. You can even have streptospirilla, staphylospirilla, things like that. But this is just some of the general shape and growth structure names we use to name bacteria. So if you were to see this one on the top right, you could easily say, oh, that's a streptococcus, or on the lower left, that's a I'm sorry, this is the staphylococcus on the top right, and a streptobacillus on the bottom left. All right. So let's talk about this one bacteria in general. This is one, if we're in lab, we would look at this under the microscope. This is we can see based on the cell morphology. First of all, it's a bacillus and it grows in a chain, so it's streptobacillus. And this is Bacillus cereus. It is just a rod-shaped bacteria that we would look at. These things are found in the soil. They can cause illness. But if you look at, so on the left here is just a generic picture, but if you get even sharper picture on the right here, you can see these little, and if the bacteria have been in certain conditions, you can see these little white spots in here. And these are endospores that the bacteria has formed. This is very different than like spores of a plant that's sending out seed spores. Endospores for bacteria is basically a way for it's kind of like a little cocoon the bacteria puts itself in so it can survive like harsh conditions. So if it's getting too hot for the bacteria and the environment's growing in, it'll form these endospores and protect itself. This isn't always there. It's only there when the conditions get harsh. So on the left, you can't see these endospores, but on the right, you put them in harsher conditions, they start forming these endospores. And these endospores will stay in this format until conditions are favorable again, so it can come back and grow normally. All right, it's not reproduction; it's just a response to environmental stress. So most bacteria can be classified in two forms, or in two ways: gram-positive and gram-negative. Okay, and what are we talking about? Well, Gram is some dude's name, first of all, that discovered this, but there's a difference in these two, and you can lump a lot of your bacteria into these two categories. So gram-positive bacteria have this thick cell wall with lots of layers of this peptidoglycan. It's just sugar, basically. And I've got an image of that down here. You've got your plasma membrane, like your cells have a plasma membrane. Bacteria cells, in addition to that plasma membrane, have this in this picture, it's 3 layers of this peptidoglycan cell wall, okay? Now, when I say cell wall, it's not like a plant cell wall that's super rigid, but it has some rigidity to it. But it is, in addition to the plasma membrane, it's got this cell wall. And in a gram-positive bacteria, it's got, like I said, multi-layers of this sugar basically set up. And you can see that on the left here. So gram-negative bacteria usually have a thinner cell wall, and they have this layer of the same peptidoglycan layer, but then on top of that, they have a little lipid layer here, a little fat layer on top of that has endotoxins in it, or LPS, which is a lipopolysaccharide. This actual endotoxin is what would cause you to get sick if you had food poisoning. Your body will want to reject this. You'll vomit and things like that to get rid of it. And generally speaking, your gram-negative bacteria are a little nastier than your gram-positive usually. And this is, like I said, the main difference. And you can stain bacteria for this difference to see if it's a gram-negative or a gram-positive bacteria. All right. So here we've got 2 different bacteria on the same slide, and we stained it with different stains. One stains for gram-positive and one stains for gram-negative. So on this situation, our gram-positive bacteria are these spherical ones, these cocci bacteria, and they look like a staphylococcus, right? Because they're growing in clusters, and they are this dark blue / deep purple color. And then we also got some gram-negative bacteria, bacilli. They don't appear to be growing in any clusters. They're just individual, maybe a couple of chains here. So it could be a streptobacillus. But they stain a little pinkish on the gram-negative stain. So you can stain for both of these things on one slide and end up seeing both different types of bacteria. And it can help you identify what kind of bacteria they're gram-negative or gram-positive. And like I said, these gram-negative ones are kind of the nastier of the bunch and usually are the ones that cause a lot of illnesses. And, you know, knowing what kind of bacteria you have can help your doctors figure out how to best treat an infection, a bacterial infection, depending on what kind of bacteria is there. Okay, now I want to talk about a bacteria that is in the environment that we see a lot, the cyanobacteria. This usually grows on the top of water. And there's a nice picture of it here on the right. This is not algae, okay? Algae is a completely different type of cell than the cyanobacteria. So a lot of times people confuse it with algae. This is a blue-green bacteria, cyano means blue-green, that can do photosynthesis. So it adds oxygen to the atmosphere just like a plant does because it does photosynthesis. But you really see this in areas that have high or excess phosphates and nitrates. So if you get some runoff from an agricultural field where they've sprayed on fertilizers, you can see a lot of this cyanobacteria possibly growing in the water. These guys are single-celled, but they can clump together and form colonies. And the shape of these colonies can be anything from spheres, plates, to filaments, all right? Now, under certain conditions, these guys can produce some harmful toxins and can cause the water not only to be undrinkable, but can even kill what's in the water. These guys have been around for billions of years, okay? They've been, fossils of them have been found and been tested to be like 3 billion years old. It's one of the oldest things, you know, on Earth. And the Earth is only 4.5 billion years old. So that tells you they've been around for a long time. Now, one of these cyanobacteria is one called Oscillatoria. And I'm not going to show you this, but if you get a chance to watch this video, it's very short. It's like 30 seconds. It shows the Oscillatoria. And why they get this name Oscillatoria is because they will, when they're growing, they kind of slide past each other. And so it gets this sliding oscillation, it's called. That's how it got its name. Once again, grows in water, can form, you know, mats on the water. And they basically reproduce by growing and then breaking off and continue to grow and break off. So fragmentation, right? And like I said, if you get a chance, watch this video on YouTube, or even just Google Oscillatoria. You can find tons of videos on that. All right, so that is all I'm going to say about bacteria and protists or prokaryotes in general. Now I want to get into eukaryotes. And like I said, in eukaryotic domain, we have 4 kingdoms or 4 major kingdoms: plants, fungi, animals, and then the protists, which is several kingdoms, really are lumped in this protist category. So let's start talking about the protists first. So these are, like I said, they're eukaryotes, but they don't really fit in any other kingdom. They kind of get lumped here. So it's a very large group of things, and a lot of them are parasites, okay? So these guys, they usually have flagella, which are like kind of like little whips that come out that they use to help move. And they eat things to get their food. So they are heterotrophic, means they have to eat to get nutrients. They grow in water usually. And we got some nice ones down here. Well, I say nice samples. You've got Giardia here on the left. You've got an amoeba here in the center, and you've got trypanosomes here on the right. All 3 of these are parasites. If you get any of these, you're going to get vomiting, diarrhea. They're nasty little buggers. And you can get these from drinking contaminated water. So you don't want any of these, trust me. you will not enjoy it. So this is another protist. This is not as harmful as those last ones. This is Euglena. And this guy has, and this is what's talking about with the flagella, it's got this kind of like whip-like thing that comes out to help it. It whips it back and forth to help it move. These guys are found in water in environments. And these guys can do both heterotrophs, so they eat other organisms, bacteria, or other protists. And they can also do photosynthesis, so they're autotrophs as well. So they're both heterotrophs and autotrophs. So they can get their nutrients 2 different ways. All right, nice video of that here you can check out sometime. It just shows them swimming through past the screen on a microscope. Now I will say, if you were to look at this in the lab, these guys are so fast that you would not be able to really see them well. So we stick them in this goo kind of called the proto-slow that slows them down. It's almost like a thick syrupy stuff for them, so you can visualize them under the microscope. So algae. So let me go back up here. Oh, too far. All right, so we're still in protists, and algae still fall under that protist kingdom. Okay, we haven't quite got yet into plants, fungi, and animal. Algae is not a plant. It is a protist. Okay, algae usually grow in water, like most of these protists do, but you can find them in soil. These guys strictly do photosynthesis. They can do 2 forms of reproduction, asexual or sexual, but you don't have to know that. They're a little bit more complex than single-celled organisms. Okay, so let's talk about a certain one algae here that's really fascinating. Is this one called volvox, and they usually grow in these spherical shapes, and each one of these little dots on here is an individual cell, and each one of those individual cells actually has 2 flagella on it. So if you look at these guys under a microscope, they kind of spin in circles and move around at the same, like across the lens or across your screen in any direction while spinning. Now these guys, like I said, algae are photosynthetic, so they have chloroplasts in them, and you can see this green. Now this green you see in here is not chloroplasts. Chloroplasts are in the individual cells. What you see inside here is basically its babies. This is how it reproduces. These are the daughter cells that kind of develop inside here. And eventually what happens is this thing rips open and spills these out. And these all will go on to grow up and eventually get this way, this big, and have their own daughter colonies inside them. So I just want to point that out. They look a lot greener than this because they're a lot, smaller and fewer cells, whereas this is, you're getting more light to come through here and you can't quite see the greenness of it. And there's a great video once again here of volvox kind of moving around, and it's a relaxing video to watch if you choose. All right, so that is protists. So now we're going to get into one of our other kingdoms in eukaryotes is fungi, or fungi. Actually, both are correct pronunciations. These guys are eukaryotes. These actually use a sort of an external digestion to absorb their food. You can have both single-celled and multi-celled organisms in this fungi. So you get single-celled organisms like yeast, but most of them are multicellular, like mushrooms and molds. They have, chitin in their cell walls as opposed to you don't need to know that, but other proteins that bacteria use and things like that bacteria have peptidoglycans. These have chitin. So they have this network of hyphae. So each one of these individual filaments you see in this drawing is called a hyphae. And a group of these together is called the mycelium. And so usually the mycelium is what is referred to as what's underground here. So individual hyphae as a group are called mycelium. And then anytime you see this actual mushroom that we know as a mushroom. This is your fruiting part, your fruiting body, and this is what will come up and to spread the spores around from these guys. So, you know, mushrooms can be both beneficial and harmful. You can see mushrooms growing on decomposing things as well, and usually where mushrooms grow because they suck nutrients up that way. But some mushrooms are good to eat, some are poisonous, so you got to be careful what you eat. To me, I don't like any mushrooms. I think they're gross and slimy, but that's just me. All right, so mushrooms reproduce, or fungi in general, sorry, reproduce by making spores. Like I said earlier, that's different than those bacterial spores we talked about. These spores each will go on to form a new fungi, a new. They're just like basically like their offspring. So fungi in general, you can group them into three major groups. About a third of them live in mutually beneficial associations with things. Lichens is one we'll talk about in detail in a little bit. About a third of them are decomposers. That's where our mushrooms come in. They're decomposers. So that you'll see those growing on like, you know, wood or, you know, things that are decomposing in nature. You'll see mushrooms there. And then about a third of them are parasites that live in or on other organisms and cause harm. So bracket fungi on a tree is a parasite, or athlete's foot in humans is a fungal parasite, right? Nobody wants that athlete's foot. And that is based on a fungus. So you have to get an antifungal to get rid of athlete's foot. Side note, I heard a interesting story. You know, if you've ever had athlete's foot, people, I don't know if you've heard this or not, but people will say, oh, you can just pee on it in the shower and that will kill the athlete's foot. That is not true. It is true that urea, which is in your urine, is one of the major components of treatments for athlete's foot, but you don't have enough urea in there in a concentrated enough form to do any damage to this athlete's foot, much less you're washing it off in the shower anyway. So don't think that works. By the way, pee does not work on jellyfish stings either. It can actually make it hurt more. So just I like to debunk some of these rumors you hear. Okay, so here's another fungus we'll talk about, yeast. So you know yeast is really important in baking in general. If you want to make bread, you better have yeast. Otherwise you get some very flat bread. As well as yeast is important for making beer or alcohol in general. And here we've got on the left, we've got someone took some yeast and streaked it onto this petri dish that's got some gelatinous nutrients in here for the yeast to grow on top of, and they've streaked out. And each one of these little colonies, individual colonies you can see here, contain thousands of individual yeast cells. Okay, so if you take one of those and you put it under the microscope, you can see this image on the right. You got your individual yeast cells here. They're all spherical. They're very small. Honestly, if you look at these under a microscope, because this picture is more like a electron microscope, so you can see better. If you look at these under one of our microscopes, it literally looks like a speck of, you know, pepper. You can't see very well detail in there. They are bigger. Some of them are bigger than, well, they can be bigger than bacteria, but it's still hard to see because they're just little round specks. They do asexual, some of them do asexual reproduction, like this budding you see here. They make little buds of themselves and split off that way. These guys are single-celled eukaryotes. Like I said, a lot of them are pathogenic to humans. Yeast in general can be bad, but they can also be good for cooking and things like that. Here's another, this is a fungus, a mold. So bread mold. Now this image here, you see they've enlarge this so you can see it does not look like this on a piece of moldy bread. It looks more like a little fuzz layer on here. But they've enlarged this to show detail. So you've got the mycelium, as we said, these are the individual hyphae that grow under the surface that you can't see. This is where the nutrients get absorbed. And then on the top, you see the fruiting body, the vegetative body that comes up to basically reproduce. These spores get spread around. Here's a nice image of bread mold growing here on the top right corner. So these reproductive structures are called aerial hyphae because they grow up in the air, I guess, up above the surface. But they're also called mycelia, by the way, not to try to confuse you that much. But that's the fuzzy part of the mold. The vegetative hyphae, which is this lower part, is your mycelia down here. That's the part that sucks up the nutrients, or that's on the surface of the bread in this situation, where they get their nutrients from. Here's a nice petri dish someone grew of this bread mold. And if you see this black portion on here, that's the point where the aerial hyphae have grown to where they're producing spores. And so you can see this around the edge of this petri dish. It's making spores so it can reproduce and spread those spores out so that more fungus will grow. All right. Here's another fungus, Ascomyces. And they get this name Ascomyces because their spores are in little sacs. Penicillin is one of these. You know penicillin to be a beneficial drug, and it's kind of a mold, but it's a fungus that's a mold kind of. And there's a nice up close here of the actual aerial hyphae. You can see these like little finger-shaped projections that have the spores. And down here we got Aspergillus, or Aspergillus, either one's correct. And their spores look like this. You can see, all right. All right, so lichens. I mentioned this briefly before. This is a fungus, or it's in the fungus category domain. But it's a symbiotic relationship with a fungus and a blue-green algae. So here we got kind of a strange thing going on. We got a protist, the algae, and the fungus living together and in symbiotic relationship. So in a symbiotic relationship, both organisms benefit. And in this situation, the fungus portion is able to provide like mineral and water absorption and helps provide like a stable environment for the algae to grow in. And the algae uses photosynthesis to provide nutrients to the whole symbiotic organism. All right. These guys, if you see growing on a tree, these like splotchy looking green things, that's a lichen. Some animals just eat lichens for their food intake, and like I said, numerous animals eat that. If you see numbers of lichens on it, you normally see these on trees. It's not harming the tree at all or the surface it's on, but these guys can be used as a good indicator for the quality of the air. If you see a lot of lichens, you know the air quality is good. If you see very little, you can probably guess that the air quality is going to be bad. So let's take a look at some of these lichens. You get three major growth categories that we talked about. You got crustose or crusty ones. These are usually flat, look like cracked, dry, stuff there. But that is how they look. They're not dried out. That's just how they grow. Very closely attached to whatever they're growing to. And then foliose, this is the one, if you go outside and look at your tree, it's probably got one of these growing on there. These are very leafy. They usually grow in a circle. And that's just the most common one you see. A little harder to find are these fruticose ones. They're usually shrub-like, or they can look like these beard-like calls hanging down from trees. This is different, I believe, than Spanish moss. Don't quote me on that. But the one that I've seen, I've got in my backyard are these. They look like little tiny trees growing up. They're little tiny shrubs. They're probably like a centimeter in height at most, and they just look like little tiny trees growing there. That's a fruticose lichen. So again, all of these, it's a symbiotic relationship going on between blue-green algae and whoops, back too far, between blue-green algae and a fungus. Okay, so these are all different types of that symbiotic relationship going on. All right, so let's talk about some more fungi, some that we're really familiar with, mushrooms. And as I said before, the mushroom portion, the stalk and the cap, usually we eat, you can eat that whole thing if it's an edible mushroom. This is the fruiting part of the mushroom. This is, if you were to take and look at, if you were able to harvest all the mycelium that's underground, all the hyphae that's underground, and get rid of all the dirt and wash it, this would actually weigh more than the mushroom that's above ground, because there's so much more of this. It's just all spread out. And but the majority of the mushroom is underground in this mycelium. Now, this fruiting body is very important because this is where the spores come from. So if you turn a mushroom over, you'll see these, what we call gills. They just named them that because they kind of look like fish gills, but they are not like fish gills at all. They're gills, and if you were able to zoom in really close on this, you'd see what look like little tiny crystal balls on each one, little tiny black crystals on each one of these, all over the place. And those are the spores. And the spores will go out with the wind and float away and form new mushrooms. Now, another fungi is this bracket fungi. This is one of the ones we talked about, was parasitic, also called shelf fungi. And they basically suck the life out of a tree. If you see these on a tree, that tree is going to die. There's no question, or has died already. If the tree looks healthy, otherwise it doesn't matter. It's going to die. These only come out after years of the fungus growing in the tree and sucking up nutrients. It will produce these fruiting bodies, and these are usually really hard and almost, they almost seem like wood. They're so hard. But this is the mushroom or the fungus growing out of here. And this is the fruiting part. So this is where the spores would come out. And any, dead or dying tree, these spores can get into and grow again and continue to grow on dead or dying trees. All right. So that is all we have. We're not going to get into today into any of the other kingdoms. We'll save that for another class period. We're not going to get into plants or animals by any means, because those are more complex. Those are not simple organisms. So that's all I have for this week as far as lecture. There is no question set this week. There is going to be a quiz, and there is going to be a labster. I haven't put those up yet, but I will. But there's no question set, so you get a little break there. All right. If you have any questions, just send me an email. And that's it. Let me know if you have any questions, and have a good week.